So joining us live right now is the Secretary of the Interior, David Bernhardt, as well as Senator Kevin Cramer. To both you guys, thanks so much for joining us. We really, really appreciate it. Secretary Bernhardt, thank you for coming to North Dakota. And I got to share with you, I had a chance to visit with some of the people that were at the Hope Roundtable today, and they said to me, they said, Chris, I want to tell you something. Seeing Secretary Bernhardt there today, I left Hope with some hope. So thank you so much for doing that, sir.
Well, that's fantastic, and I left with some hope. I think there's a pathway forward, and we're going to be working on that over the next few weeks and be back to Senator Hoeven and Senator Cramer with the proposal, and then back to the people in North Dakota.
So you mentioned proposal, and I want to get to some of that, but I want to hear from you. I heard that you were out today at Mr. Johansson's land, got a chance to sort of see what took place for him and how it obviously impacted his life. Very emotional story. Two things I want to know from you. One, how did his story impact you? And two, what do you take from his story that you can take back to the bureaucrats in D.C. and tell them, hey, here's what we need to do to better protect our farmers and private property rights?
Well, I think the reality is we have one basic principle in Interior that's really very important, and that is that we need to be a good neighbor. And at the same time, we need to remember that we serve the American people, not the other way around. And, you know, those are two directions from the president, and those are two directions that we're going to live by.
But how do you communicate that to people in D.C. that I'm presuming a lot of people in D.C. have never really been on a farm? They don't understand a pothole or a wetland in North Dakota. So what did you see today? What have you gathered to say, okay, guys, here's how we can better serve the American people?
So we have great people in Interior, and sometimes they lack a little clarity of direction. And what I think I am leaving with is an understanding of the situation that will allow me to give them some direction that says, here's a common sense solution. Here's, you know, after asking them a few questions and hearing from the folks here, here's our pathway forward, and directing that we move forward on that pathway. And so already this evening I sent a memo to the leadership of the service and the Assistant Secretary saying, I have these questions, let's address these questions, and then from there I'll move forward. And I think that the service completely respects the need to address these things with clarity, and so that's what we'll be trying to do.
Senator Cramer already moving the ball down the field, so I know our landowners are happy to hear that. For you, sir, being there, I know you hear a lot of this feedback from people here in North Dakota. Two things. One, what stood out to you most today? And I know I've heard you talk about, hey, cooperation is conservation. After today, how do you see farmers and landowners better working with the Fish and Wildlife for more cooperation, more conservation, but also respect of private property rights?
Sure. Well, you nailed it. They've always wanted to do that. Remember that North Dakota's history is rich in the sense that it's our landowners and our agrarians, really, our farmers and ranchers, who have been the best stewards of the land. And I think the federal government needs to recognize that cooperating with states, cooperating with the landowners will have the best outcome. And sometimes it's easy to understand. Not every part of the country is like North Dakota or the Midwest. It's easy to understand why a zealous bureaucrat might not think that the outcome's going to be as good without his or her input or his or her enforcement. But here's the other thing that I came away with today, Chris. It's just, it sort of overwhelms me in a way. You're sitting here talking to the cabinet secretary, second one in 2 days, by the way, from the Trump administration, as we prepare for another one to come over the weekend and early next week in Administrator Wheeler. If you added up all of the days that the Trump administration's just cabinet secretaries now, and the president and vice president themselves, have been to North Dakota, you couldn't, if you took the last 3 or 4 administrations, added up all of theirs over the course of multiple terms, you wouldn't have as many visits from cabinet secretaries as this president has had. And that's because Dave Bernhardt is actually a reflection of Donald Trump's commitment to accessibility, accountability, you know, working with people out there and making a real difference. So to me, my heart was warmed just watching it all play out right in front of my eyes.
Senator, me too. I mean, yesterday we had the Western Governors Association in town. So, Mr. Secretary, just, I mean, it seems like North Dakota is sort of the epicenter of some action right now. So I hope as well you can go back to D.C. and tell some of those people, hey, it's not flyover country. There's some really good things happening back there in the Midwest. Mr. Secretary, the other conversation I had today with some landowners in our area is the fact that, they want to go out maybe and tile their land or dig a ditch or whatnot, and they call up the U.S. Fish and Wildlife and go, hey, here's what I want to do. Are you okay with that? And often the response is, I don't know. You'll probably find out if we summon you to go see a judge. What can you do to provide more clarity and more certainty so if people do want to go out and make an impact or make a difference on their land, they've got some certainty? I mean, farmers deal with enough uncertainty. What can you do to provide more certainty for them?
Well, we fundamentally recognize that there needs to be clarity here. And so one of the things I've asked specifically is what data files we could have available to us to easily give farmers. And that's a technological question that I'll be getting some data on very quickly. We need to be able to answer their questions when they ask, and we need to be responsive. And those are not elements that the average citizen thinks are unreasonable. And so we need to be able to provide those, and we will. The way that we go about identifying these areas, we're going to look at how other federal agencies also look at them to ensure that they're not getting two sets of directions at two different times by two different parts of the government. And that all goes back to the need to ensure that the American people are getting the best service they can from the government.
Do you see your department working closer with the NRCS, sir, so that more of that stuff is the same rather than U.S. Fish and Wildlife saying one thing and NRCS saying another?
Yeah, I think that what I'm going to do is evaluate both how we do things, how they do things, and why we can't have a harmonious approach. Absolutely. It doesn't help to add complexity if it's unnecessary. So that definitely will be something we'll be looking at over the next few days.
Gentlemen, I got a couple more things I want to visit with you about. But Senator, I know one of the a while back, Mr. Secretary had sent you a letter with 3 different things they wanted to focus on. One of those was to establish an effective appeals process for landowners.
Yeah.
What's the status on that?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. And it'll be a good one for the Secretary to answer as well, because they've already started considering that. One of the challenges you have in the federal government, and it's certainly true of the Fish and Wildlife Service, it's true of other agencies as well, and that is oftentimes the appeal process just remains in a circle in the same exact agency. So the person that said you can't do something before is the same person you appeal to again and again and again. It's one of the ways that a lot of our farmers and landowners eventually either go broke or they walk away. It's rare that somebody has the courage that the Johansons had to take them on all the way into the federal appellate court and then win. The problem is even winning is losing because you're broke by the time you get to the victory. So you're exactly right that the Secretary has committed to and has been working on that, on a better appeals process that gives more sense of confidence to the outcome.
So one of the things we discussed today that's very important to me, and I wanted to hear from the folks on the ground, was exactly what their view of the questions that be presented during an appeal was. It's very important that our process be something that could actually answer the questions that they would likely raise. And so I was briefed yesterday on where our process was. I gave our team some suggestions of how I wanted it to head. And then today's meeting with the folks on the ground here in North Dakota really allowed me to go back and provide some additional commentary so that we can be focused on the precise things we need to be. They'll be helpful both to the department and to the folks out here.
Mr. Secretary, thank you for that. Keep moving the ball down the field. I want to touch on 2 more things with you, gentlemen. One is I know tomorrow you're going to be making an announcement, I've heard, at Bismarck State College and then heading off to Medora. What can you tell us about your announcement tomorrow morning?
Well, I think I need to save tomorrow for tomorrow, but
I tried.
The reality is we'll be rolling out some news.
Does it have to do with Medora, or what is it around?
We're doing a number of things in North Dakota, and we'll be highlighting one.
All right, so I want to know what you were expecting, though, from your trip to Medora. Obviously, they're going to be talking about this TR library. How does the Department of the Interior work with the state of North Dakota to bring this TR library to fruition? And are you 100% behind this TR library?
Yeah, so I think where we come in is obviously we have management responsibilities there, and we certainly are supportive of the idea. We think there are different options for the community and the state, the private sector, and to think about, and some of those options involve us playing a very meaningful role. And I'll be there to listen, hear about particular ideas, and talk about precisely how folks want to move forward. And there are certainly, I don't think there's anyone in America, frankly, who doesn't embrace the concept of this particular historical site, the particular great president who happens to be America's greatest conservationist. And so I think that there's great unanimity in supporting the idea and the means to go forward. And, you know, we want to be a good partner and a good neighbor and make sure that whatever mechanism we come up with is something that works for everybody and will be successful.
Mr. Secretary, I want to get your thoughts on this, and then Senator, since you are on the Senate Armed Services Committee, if you want to jump in as well, and since you've been dubbed by the President to help with the border wall. Mr. Secretary, recently you transferred some jurisdiction of 5 segments to the Department of Army to secure some land for the border wall. One, if you can tell us a little bit more about that, and two, I know our audience cares deeply about what's happening down at the southern border. Can you do a lot more of this, please?
Well, here's exactly what I did. The Secretary of Defense made a request through the Secretary of Army announcing that the military needed certain properties based on the emergency situation. So I personally went down, looked at each of these sites, made my own determination that there is clearly an emergency, and made what we call an emergency withdrawal. And let me tell you, the situation down there is serious, it's extraordinary, and not only is it devastating for all of the reasons that the military would identify and the President has identified, but it's also devastating to the environmental and natural resource values that we hold dear in our own conservation areas and lands. And the reality is, without some serious restraint on coming across the border, we're in a situation where they are devastating the environment in very significant ways. And that's, you know, in addition to the true humanitarian crisis that you see and the burdens that are imposed on folks. And so the reality is that those boundaries, I believe, are absolutely appropriate and necessary. And I came to the conclusion that there was an emergency there, and there were a couple parcels that we in the Department of Defense are still working through. But, you know, should the military make that request, it's my duty to consider it and make a decision as to whether or not emergency exists, and I will do that without batting an eye.
Senator, maybe you can get in Secretary Esper's ear a little bit and make some more parcels available through the Department of Interior. So, Mr. Secretary, thank you so much for being in North Dakota. A lot of people really appreciated the conversation today at Hope. Senator Cramer, I know you're going to stick around for another segment because there is a lot to talk about today with President Trump and everything happening. So please stay with us, folks. Mr. Secretary, thanks again for being here. And Senator Cramer is going to stick around. We'll talk with him more in just a couple of moments. So stay with us. Much more coming up right here on Point of View.